Imagine being 15 years old, stepping onto one of the biggest stages in rock music, and half the audience is hoping you fail. They've already decided you don't belong. They've written your story before you've played a single note. That was Wolfgang Van Halen's nightmare. The son of guitar legend Eddie Van Halen, Wolfgang didn't just inherit a famous name. He inherited expectations that would crush most people, a shadow so massive the world couldn't see him standing right in front of them, and criticism so brutal it nearly destroyed him. But this isn't a story about living in someone's shadow. This is about what happens when you refuse to let the world define you. Wolfgang Van Halen went from the most hated teenager in rock to a Grammy-nominated artist who plays every instrument on his albums, headlines sold-out tours, and performed at the Oscars. The journey? It's one of the most powerful transformations you'll ever hear. Born into a legend, he never asked for March 1991. Wolfgang Van Halen enters the world, and the cameras are already flashing. Not because he did anything special, but because his father is Eddie Van Halen, the man who revolutionized rock guitar, and his mother is Valerie Bertinelli, America's beloved actress. Together, they're Hollywood royalty, the kind of couple everyone knew, the kind of life everyone envied. But here's what nobody saw. Behind the gates of their home, away from the flashing cameras and screaming fans, Eddie and Valerie made a radical decision. Wolfgang would have a normal childhood. Not a celebrity childhood, a normal one. And somehow, against all odds, they pulled it off. Wolfgang's early years weren't private jets and exclusive parties. They were Saturday morning cartoons with a bowl of cereal, action figures scattered on the living room floor, homework struggles at the kitchen table, and family dinners debating pizza versus Chinese food. Sure, there were gold records hanging on the walls and Grammy trophies sitting on shelves, but to Wolfgang, they were just decorations. He had no idea what they meant. He didn't understand that millions of people around the world worshipped his father like some kind of rock god. To Wolfgang Van Halen, Eddie Van Halen was just dad. The guy with really long hair who told the corniest jokes. The guy who taught him how to ride a bike, running alongside him in the driveway until Wolfgang found his balance. The guy who tucked him into bed every night and told him wild stories about dragons and adventures. Valerie Bertinelli worked tirelessly to keep Wolfgang grounded in reality. She set boundaries that most celebrity parents would never consider. She established routines. She gave him chores. She enforced rules. She made absolutely sure that fame and privilege didn't warp her son's understanding of the world. "My mom did a really good job at grounding me," Wolfgang would say years later, gratitude thick in his voice. It wasn't lavish or insane. It felt completely normal. And even when actual rock and roll legends would drop by their house, guys whose faces were on album covers and whose songs dominated radio stations, Wolfgang's world remained remarkably small and safe. He'd peek around the corner and see his dad jamming with some famous musician, shrug like it was no big deal, and go right back to playing his video games. He didn't care about fame. He cared about beating the next level. But childhood innocence doesn't last forever. No matter how hard your parents try to protect you, eventually the real world breaks through. And for Wolfgang Van Halen, that moment came sooner than anyone expected. One random afternoon, Wolfgang was digging through his father's massive collection of vinyl records, pulling out albums at random and studying the colorful covers with innocent curiosity. And then he found one that stopped him dead in his tracks. The cover showed his father standing on this enormous stage, absolutely bathed in blinding spotlights, surrounded by what looked like an ocean of people. Not hundreds, not even thousands. Tens of thousands of screaming fans, all reaching toward the stage like they were trying to touch something holy. The man on that album cover didn't look like his dad. He looked like a superhero. He looked mythical, larger than life, untouchable. Wolfgang stared at that album for what felt like forever, confusion swirling in his young mind, and then he carried it to his father. "What's this?" he asked, holding up the record with both hands. Eddie Van Halen looked at the album, then looked at his son, and this complicated expression crossed his face. You could see the pride there, but also something heavier. Maybe worry, maybe sadness, maybe fear of what was about to change. "Oh yeah," Eddie said, trying to keep his voice casual. "This is what I do." And just like that, in one single, innocent moment, Wolfgang Van Halen's childhood ended. The protective bubble popped. The veil lifted. The illusion of normalcy shattered. The man who had taught him how to tie his shoes wasn't just his dad. He was a hero to millions of people around the entire planet. He was a legend whose name would be remembered for generations. He was an icon who had changed music forever. And suddenly, Wolfgang understood something that would change everything about his life moving forward. Things were never going to be simple. From that day on, the world looked at Wolfgang Van Halen differently. Or maybe Wolfgang just started noticing the way they'd been looking at him all along. Every single time he showed even the tiniest bit of interest in music, people watched him with intense, hawk-like focus. Every time he picked up an instrument, they compared him to his father. Every time he played a note, they measured it against a legend. Is he as talented as Eddie? Does he have the same gift? Will he carry the legacy forward? Can he possibly live up to the Van Halen name? The questions came before Wolfgang even understood what a legacy was. The pressure started building before his shoulders were strong enough to carry it. And the world, with all its expectations and demands and judgments, decided exactly who Wolfgang Van Halen should become long before he had any say in the matter. But even as a young child, Wolfgang had something most people don't develop until much later in life: wisdom beyond his years, self-awareness, a quiet, powerful understanding that the only way forward was through complete authenticity. He didn't want to be Eddie Van Halen 2.0. He didn't want to spend his entire life trapped in a never-ending tribute act, recreating his father's magic note for note, forever stuck in someone else's shadow. No, Wolfgang wanted something different. He wanted to discover his own voice, his own sound, his own identity, his own story. That decision, made somewhere deep in the heart of a boy who just wanted to be himself, would become the foundation for everything that followed. The music lessons that built a foundation. Eddie Van Halen wasn't one of those celebrity dads who lived vicariously through their kids. He didn't wake Wolfgang up at 5 in the morning for mandatory practice sessions. He didn't force him onto stages before he was ready. He didn't demand perfection or punish every little mistake. Instead, Eddie gave his son something far more valuable than technical skills or fancy tricks. He gave him space to breathe and explore, freedom to make mistakes and learn from them, permission to fail without judgment, and the patience to let real talent bloom naturally, organically, in its own time. When Wolfgang was about 8 years old, still young enough to believe in superheroes and magic, Eddie decided it was finally time to introduce his son to the world of music. But not in the way most people would expect. Most people would assume Eddie Van Halen would hand his son a guitar on day one. After all, Eddie is literally one of the greatest guitarists who ever lived. Of course he'd want to pass that torch down immediately, right? Wrong. Because Eddie Van Halen understood something profound. Music isn't just about playing the right notes. Music is about foundation. It's about rhythm and timing and discipline and understanding how all the pieces fit together to create something greater. So instead of handing Wolfgang a guitar and setting him up for inevitable comparisons, Eddie gave his son a pair of drumsticks. The lesson Eddie created was absolutely absurd, almost laughable in its simplicity. He walked into the kitchen, grabbed a tall stack of magazines from the recycling bin, old issues of Rolling Stone and Guitar Player with glossy covers, and he placed them on the kitchen table. Then he handed Wolfgang a pair of drumsticks, the wood smooth and light in the boy's small hands. And then Eddie said something Wolfgang would remember for the rest of his life. If you can hit these magazines in time, keep a steady rhythm without speeding up or slowing down. That's what playing drums is all about. That was the entire lesson. No fancy drum kit, no expensive equipment, no professional instruction. Just a stack of old magazines and a simple challenge. Wolfgang probably stared at those magazines, then looked up at his father, wondering if this was some kind of joke. But Eddie's face was completely serious. So Wolfgang started hitting those magazines with the drumsticks. At first, it was pure chaos. Random whacks with no rhythm, no pattern, no purpose whatsoever. Just noise. But slowly, methodically, patiently, Wolfgang began to find something buried in that chaos. A beat, a pulse, a rhythm that felt right, that felt good, that felt like music. He would sit at that kitchen table for hours and hours, his little hands gripping those drumsticks until his palms got sweaty. Concentration etched on his young face, sweat forming on his forehead, his arms growing tired and sore. But he didn't stop. He didn't complain. He didn't ask if he could take a break. Because there was something almost hypnotic about finding that perfect rhythm, something deeply satisfying about taking chaos and random noise and turning it into order and music and art. Eddie would pretend to be busy in another room, reading a magazine or watching TV. But really, he was just listening to his son discover the fundamental truth of music for the very first time. And a small, proud smile would slowly form on his face. Because Eddie didn't need to hover over Wolfgang's shoulder. He didn't need to micromanage every single move or correct every tiny mistake. His son was already pushing himself harder than any teacher or instructor ever could. Before long, Eddie decided Wolfgang had earned himself an upgrade. He went out and bought his son a small beginner drum kit. Nothing fancy or professional, nothing that cost thousands of dollars, just a basic starter set. But to Wolfgang, it might as well have been made of pure gold. He set up that drum kit in his bedroom and then basically disappeared for hours at a time, completely losing himself in the rhythm. Boom, crack, boom, crack. That steady, powerful pulse echoing through the entire house. Valerie would smile and shake her head, grateful that her son had found something he genuinely loved, but also quietly wondering how much longer her sanity could possibly survive the constant noise. Alex Van Halen. Wolfgang's uncle and the legendary drummer who had powered Van Halen's explosive sound for decades, couldn't help but take notice. And when he finally got a chance to hear his young nephew really play, not just mess around but actually play with skill and feeling, Alex was genuinely, honestly impressed. The kid had serious chops, real, legitimate, undeniable talent. And not just because his last name happened to be Van Halen, but because he had put in the hours. He had done the unglamorous, repetitive, sometimes boring work that most kids his age would never have the discipline to do. By the time Wolfgang turned 9 years old, he had developed genuinely impressive drumming skills. But more importantly, way more importantly, he had developed something that can't be taught in any classroom, or learned from any book. He had developed discipline, an unshakable work ethic, a deep understanding that greatness, real greatness, doesn't come from winning the genetic lottery, or getting lucky, or having famous parents who open doors for you. Greatness comes from showing up every single day, even when you're exhausted, even when you're frustrated, even when nobody's watching and nobody cares, and doing the work anyway, putting in the hours, making the sacrifices, pushing through the pain and the boredom and the moments when you want to quit. By the time Wolfgang hit his teenage years, his curiosity pulled him toward the guitar. It was inevitable. How could someone grow up in a house where revolutionary guitar riffs had been born and not feel drawn to it? But for Wolfgang, picking up that guitar wasn't about following his father's footsteps. It was about understanding, about figuring out how 6 strings and some electricity could tell stories and evoke emotions that words alone couldn't capture. There was just one significant problem. Eddie Van Halen, despite being one of the greatest guitarists who ever lived, was an absolutely terrible teacher. "My dad wasn't the best teacher," Wolfgang admitted years later with affection in his voice. He'd just say, "Do this," and then play something only Eddie Van Halen could do. The gap between father and son wasn't emotional. They loved each other deeply. The gap was technical. Eddie's genius was instinctive, almost supernatural. He didn't think about music theory or technique. He just felt it and played it. For Wolfgang, trying to learn from that was nearly impossible. So Wolfgang made a choice that would define his entire musical identity. If he was going to learn guitar, he was going to teach himself. He started from zero. He found guitar tabs online and spent countless hours deciphering notes to songs by bands like System of a Down, Blink-182, and Foo Fighters. He wasn't trying to recreate his father's solos or write stadium anthems. He wanted something different, something raw and honest, something modern that felt authentic to who he was. It was incredibly important that I develop my own skills and my own sound, Wolfgang told Spin magazine. Otherwise, you'd just be listening to some shoddy Van Halen cover band. When the world declared war on a teenager, 2006. Wolfgang Van Halen is 15 years old. Just 15. A high school sophomore worrying about the same things most teenagers worry about. Grades, friends, that awkward phase where your voice cracks at the worst moments, normal teenager stuff. And then, his father makes a decision that changes absolutely everything. Eddie Van Halen invites Wolfgang, his 15-year-old son, to join Van Halen as their new bassist, replacing Michael Anthony, who had been with the band for decades. For hardcore fans of Van Halen, this announcement wasn't just controversial. It was blasphemous, a slap in the face, an unforgivable betrayal. Michael Anthony was beloved by millions. He had been there from the very beginning. His backing vocals and solid bass lines were a crucial part of Van Halen's signature sound. He was part of the original magic. And now, he was being replaced by a 15-year-old kid who just happened to be the boss's son. The backlash was immediate, brutal, and absolutely relentless. Online forums that had once discussed Van Halen's music with love and reverence now exploded with pure rage. Social media became an absolute war zone. 40- and 50-year-old men who had literally grown up worshiping Van Halen felt personally betrayed. And they took that betrayal out on a 15-year-old kid. They flooded comment sections with hateful messages. This is nepotism at its worst. This kid hasn't earned a single thing. He's only there because of his last name. He's a complete fraud. He's talentless. He's going to destroy this band. For Wolfgang, it was a living nightmare that never seemed to end. He loved his father deeply, and genuinely wanted to support him during what he knew was a difficult time. But the personal cost was almost unbearable. The hate was everywhere, constant and suffocating. It was tough, Wolfgang would admit years later, pain still evident in his voice. I was there to support my dad, but I became the biggest enemy of every 40 to 50-year-old man out there. Just imagine what that must have felt like. You're 15 years old, and suddenly, thousands of adults you've never met have decided they hate you. They hate you with a passion, and they want you to know it. Imagine scrolling through comments and reading message after message telling you that you're worthless, that you're a talentless hack, that you're destroying something millions of people love. Imagine knowing that every single time you step onto a stage in front of thousands of people, a significant portion of that audience actively wants you to fail. They're hoping you'll mess up so they can say, "See? I told you so." That was Wolfgang Van Halen's reality at 15. Every single show was a trial. Every note he played was examined under a microscope. Every tiny mistake was amplified and used as evidence that he didn't belong. The criticism was constant, vicious, deeply personal, and completely inescapable. It wasn't just about his bass playing, it was about him as a person, his character, his worth as a human being. Most people would have absolutely crumbled under that kind of soul-crushing pressure. Most 15-year-olds would have quit immediately, run away, and never looked back. But Wolfgang Van Halen wasn't built like most people, so he did the only thing he could do. He showed up, night after night after night, city after city. Wolfgang stepped onto stages in front of thousands of people who genuinely didn't want him there and played his heart out anyway. The 2007 to 2008 reunion tour with David Lee Roth was Wolfgang's absolute baptism by fire, and it nearly burned him alive. The pressure was crushing. The scrutiny was insane. The hate just kept coming in endless waves. But something unexpected started to happen. Slowly, grudgingly, some of those hardcore critics started to soften. They began noticing something they hadn't wanted to see. Wolfgang's bass lines were actually really good. They were tight and precise. They were creative and interesting. They were powerful. These critics started realizing Wolfgang wasn't just coasting on his famous last name. He was genuinely talented. And more than that, he was working harder than anyone else on that stage, practicing until his fingers literally bled, studying every single note. He was completely determined to prove he belonged. By 2012, when Van Halen released their album A Different Kind of Truth, Wolfgang had become an integral part of the band's sound. He had co-written several songs. He had contributed arrangements. He had proven, beyond any reasonable doubt, that he wasn't there because of nepotism. He was there because he was damn good at what he did. But even though Wolfgang had won over many critics, the damage had already been done. The scars had formed. That period did a lot of damage to me, Wolfgang confessed. The constant attacks, endless comparisons, crushing feeling that no matter how hard you work, it's never enough. It leaves scars that don't heal easily. It creates doubts whispering late at night. Are they right? Am I only here because of my name? Those doubts can eat you alive. But Wolfgang didn't let them. He acknowledged the pain, felt it fully, then kept moving forward. Because that's what survivors do. After years touring with Van Halen, Wolfgang craved something entirely his own. In 2013, he joined Tremonti, the band formed by Creed guitarist Mark Tremonti. It wasn't glamorous, but it was freedom. I went over one night at midnight, learned the entire set, Wolfgang recalled, and the next day, we were on tour. He recorded 2 albums with them, Cauterize and Dust. For the first time, Wolfgang was just another musician, not Eddie's son. Just a guy making music, building something new. For a brief moment, Wolfgang had found his path. The future looked bright. But fate had other plans that would test him beyond imagination. The loss that shattered and rebuilt him. October 6th, 2020. Ask Wolfgang about this date, and you'll see something change in his eyes. A shadow passes over his face. His voice gets quieter. Because October 6th is the day Wolfgang's world collapsed. The day his father died. Eddie Van Halen had been fighting cancer since 2001. For nearly 2 decades, he battled. He survived throat cancer and endured treatments, leaving him weak and exhausted. But he kept going. Keep playing, keep creating. Because that's who Eddie Van Halen was. A fighter, a survivor, someone who didn't know how to quit. But in 2020, cancer returned with unstoppable vengeance. It spread to his brain and infiltrated vital organs. This time, there was no miracle treatment, no last-minute recovery. The fight was over. Wolfgang was there, holding his father's hand when the strongest man he'd ever known took his last breath. In that moment, everything changed. The grief that hit Wolfgang wasn't like anything he had ever experienced. It wasn't just sadness. It was a crushing physical weight pressing on his chest, making it hard to breathe. Waking up every morning, forgetting for a split second his father was gone, then remembering and feeling loss tear through him like a knife. Some days are better than others, Wolfgang told Carson Daly, tears streaming down his face. It doesn't seem like the pain will ever go away. The world lost a guitar legend. Tributes poured in globally. Musicians shared stories. Fans mourned. News covered Eddie's death like the cultural earthquake it was. But for Wolfgang, all that noise meant nothing. He hadn't just lost a legend. He'd lost his father, his mentor, his protector, his biggest fan. The man who believed in him when the world called him a fraud. The man who taught him authenticity mattered more than approval. I feel like crawling in a hole every day, Wolfgang confessed. But I know my dad would be really pissed off at me if I did. That's the thing about grief. It gives you 2 choices. Let it bury you, or honor the person you lost by living in a way making them proud. Wolfgang chose the latter. Instead of disappearing, Wolfgang did what his father taught him. He channeled every ounce of pain into music. For months, Wolfgang locked himself in his studio. He worked like a man possessed, pouring heartbreak, love, rage, and loss into every note. Every chord was a conversation with his father's ghost. Every lyric was a letter he'd never send. Every song was processing loss too big for words. In 2021, Wolfgang released Mammoth WVH, his debut solo album. The title was loaded with meaning. Mammoth had been Eddie's first band's name before Van Halen existed. Wolfgang was honoring his father's beginning while claiming his own, and here's what made it extraordinary. Wolfgang played every single instrument himself. Every drum beat, every bass line, every guitar riff, every keyboard, every vocal, everything. It's 100% all me, Wolfgang told NPR. It's more pressure, but it's creatively freeing. The album's lead single, Distance, was written as tribute to his father. The lyrics were raw and vulnerable. No matter what the distance is, I will be with you. It wasn't about moving on. It was about carrying someone with you forever. About love surviving death. The world responded. Distance shot to #1 on Billboard's mainstream rock chart. It dominated rock radio, and it earned Wolfgang a Grammy nomination for Best Rock Song. For the first time, Wolfgang wasn't being recognized as Eddie Van Halen's son. He was being recognized as Wolfgang Van Halen, artist. At the 2022 Grammys, Wolfgang walked the red carpet with his mother and girlfriend. He didn't win, and he joked on Instagram, "We came, we saw, but we did not conquer." But beneath humor was something deeper. Eddie hadn't won a Grammy on his first nomination either. "I guess I'm following in his footsteps," Wolfgang said quietly. That same year, Wolfgang took Mammoth WVH on tour as a frontman. It terrified him. "I was in the dressing room thinking, I don't know if I can do this." But then he walked onto that stage. Lights hit him. The crowd roared, and everything changed. For the first time, Wolfgang wasn't playing his father's songs or standing in anyone's shadow. He was playing his own music, telling his own story, being his own person, and the crowd loved it. They weren't there because of Eddie. They were there because of Wolfgang. Building his own empire. In 2023, Wolfgang married photographer Andrea Alsop after 8 years together. During the ceremony, a recording of Eddie's instrumental 316 played. Eddie had composed it to celebrate Wolfgang's birth. Now, on Wolfgang's wedding day, Eddie's music filled the air. "It was a way to include my dad," Wolfgang explained. That same year, Wolfgang released Mammoth 2, again playing every instrument himself. "Luckily, people are starting to become fans of the music first," Wolfgang said, "and only then realize who my dad was." In March 2024, Wolfgang performed I'm Just Ken alongside Ryan Gosling and Slash at the Oscars. Right when Ryan whips out his abs, there's a guitar tapping solo. "And that's me," Wolfgang laughed. Standing on the Oscars stage, Wolfgang had officially arrived. Not as someone's son, but as himself. Wolfgang's story is about transformation, taking the heaviest burden, a legendary name with crushing expectations, devastating loss, and relentless criticism, and turning it into fuel. Wolfgang didn't run from his father's legacy. He honored it, but he refused to be defined by it. He became proof that you can honor where you came from while becoming who you're meant to be. Today, Wolfgang is a Grammy-nominated artist with 2 acclaimed albums, a successful touring musician, a loving husband, and a man who stepped out of the shadow by growing tall enough to cast his own. From a boy drumming on magazines to a man who built an entire sound alone, Wolfgang proves grief can turn into greatness, shadows into spotlights, and legends aren't born but forged in fire. So do you think Wolfgang has finally stepped out of his father's shadow? Or will comparisons follow him forever? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if this story moved you, smash that like button. Share it with someone struggling with expectations or grief. Subscribe and hit that bell for more powerful transformation stories every week. Stories proving your last name doesn't define your destiny. Your choices do. Wolfgang Van Halen did exactly that. His story proves the greatest tribute to a legend isn't imitation. It's evolution. Thanks for watching.